About investigation of situations, and also at the moment the approach that the regulators are broadly taking in terms of asking for risk assessments, and then perhaps some of the interactions that companies have with the regulators is around the way that they investigate these psychosocial or psychological incidents. What's not lost on me is how in traditional health and safety,
we created a leadership program for the organisation. The leadership program was at the executive level, senior manager, and supervisor, but it linked together so that it was a leadership program that connected, so we were all on the same page. I've worked in organisations previously where if you have a leadership program just for one level, it's probably not going to work because people start to do things differently and they butt heads with the people above them.
This happens all the time because establishing paperwork is easy. Yeah, it's very bureaucratic, I have implemented. The people know what this means and how this applies and how they can use this in your daily basis. So this answer is no.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Headline Podcast. Here with me, Dr. Megan Tranter, and also Andreza Arahu. And today's guest is someone who's been on the front lines of regulatory change, leadership reform, and now psychosocial safety. We're thrilled to welcome Martyn Campbell to the show. Now, Martyn is the founder of Humn, which is an organisation that's focused on psychosocial safety. But what makes Martyn's perspective especially unique is his combined background. He's not only a former regulator and executive leader, but he also used to be a lawyer, which gives him a pretty good lens on how laws, policies, and systems impact real people in the workplace. And before Humn, which is where Martyn is now, he spent nearly 6 years as the chief executive of SafeWork South Australia, where he led significant cultural and operational reform. And he's chaired some national regulatory bodies, represented Australia internationally, and he continues to challenge outdated approaches to safety. So in this conversation, we unpack what psychosocial safety really means, how legislation is changing the expectations for leaders and for organisations, and what it takes to lead with clarity in systems that sometimes are a little slow to evolve. So let's get right into it. And hello, Andreza.
Absolutely, Megan. I am as excited as you are because when you're talking about psychosocial safety, is the foundation of every high-performing teams. So today we are diving into this topic, very powerful. So welcome our special guest, Martyn.
Thank you very much. Really, really happy, really honoured to be invited to come along and talk. Thank you.
So, hey, Martyn, psychosocial safety, it's this really interesting topic, isn't it? Because it's certainly getting a lot of airplay. And sometimes people are even confusing it between psychological safety. So maybe could you help us and the guest understand a little bit what it actually is and what does it mean in the workplace context and what are people really talking about with this?
Yeah. Great question, Megan. And look, it's been a really hot topic of conversation in Australia for about 3 or 4 years now, and probably the last couple of years globally. There's still a huge amount of confusion and uncertainty around what it is. But effectively, it's about looking after workers' mental health and well-being and keeping them mentally healthy as well as physically healthy and safe at work. So it's about blending HR, industrial relations, and health and safety together to keep people mentally and healthy and safe.
It's a hot topic, and I would like to go dive in this direction. So, do you think the organizations they are prepared to psychological risks?
No, the short answer to that is no, I don't think they are. And that's quite normal. So organizations shouldn't be frightened the fact that they don't really understand it because you're in the majority. And I would say probably 95, 98% of organizations are still scratching their head wondering what it is. So the reality is in Australia in particular is psychosocial safety has always been a work health and safety duty. And it's part of the health bit of occupational health and safety. It just never really got a lot of attention and airplay the way that physical safety did. So the safety industry has been quite good at looking after the physical risks, the things that hurt our backs, stop us cutting fingers off, etc., but not so good at looking at the things that cause mental illness and distress from a psychological perspective. So about 5 years ago, the legislation in Australia was changed to specifically include mental health and well-being. And the intent was to elevate that to the same level as physical safety risks. But the duty was always there, just nobody really did anything about it. But now they have to. So we have specific law in South Australia, in Australia, and that requires businesses and senior leaders to ensure that people's mental health and well-being is treated at the same level as physical risk. And the challenge is you can't treat them the same because they're very different concepts. So what we did in Australia was created some guidance material which helped organizations understand that legislation a bit better. And we identified 17 specific psychosocial safety hazards that organizations should start to look at. And that's really the starting point, is to do the risk assessments on those 17 hazards.
Wow, 17. That's a lot.
It is. And look, the hazards are broken down into 3 groups. So there are hazards that relate to behaviors, there are hazards that relate to processes, and then organizational systems. So conventional safety is generally around protecting people from physical harm. And you can buy a barricade, you can put a guard on a machine, you can buy some PPE and protect people from physical injury. But how do you protect a worker from someone else's poor behavior? Or a system that an organization uses that causes too much stress, which then leads to a mental health or a clinical diagnosis for the psychological injury. So they're very different concepts, and that's what people are struggling with at the moment, is really understanding how those 17 hazards manifest in the workplace, and then how do you treat them? And because you can't barricade poor behavior, and you can't buy a guard or PPE to protect somebody from bullying, It's a different concept.
Yeah. But when you're talking about 17 hazards and in a systemic approach, how you see the roles from HR, the safety teams, and the leadership?
Yeah, look, the leadership response is critical. So every leadership response matters. It's incredibly important how leaders respond to these events, and psychosocial safety is no different. So when you look at the types of hazards those 17 hazards present, example being one of the hazards relates to job demands. So the job demands are that the work that's undertaken is too complex, it's too much, it's too difficult for the level of the person that you employ, or it's not stimulating enough and people are bored and it's just mundane. And so then there's job control, like how much control does a person have to do their work, and are they being micromanaged, or do they have no management? Lack of leadership support and guidance and equipment and resources. So these are all things that happen in the workplace. There's another hazard in relation to poor organizational justice. So, and this is generally, and these hazards I'm mentioning here are generally found in the HR department. So organizational justice relates to like fairness and people being treated equally, and if somebody behaves in one way, then if that behavior is replicated, the sanctions for the people will be the same. So you can't have different sanctions for the same type of behavior. These are all things that cause unfairness, which lead to sort of mental health and stress and anxiety. So if you have those or those hazards in your workplace, probably the reality is they've been dealt with by the HR team. But now in Australia, and certainly in other countries around the world who are implementing this, it's also a safety issue. So you have to work collaboratively. And if you don't work collaboratively, then you're destined for failure or mediocrity. You won't really address the issues. So leadership response incredibly important, and collaboration across HR, IR, and safety now becomes critical.
Do you identify a different stakeholder in this process, in the systemic approach? Or this is the three key stakeholders: HR, safety team, and leadership?
So for me, they're the key stakeholders to create a system and to create a systemic response. There are other stakeholders that should be consulted. So many countries now, Australia specifically, the legislation requires workers to be consulted in developing the controls. So the controls you'll probably find, if you look closely, you'll already have some controls in your workplace, but some will sit in HR, some will be industrial, some will be safety. What this approach requires is those people to come together to put the controls into the system, then consult your workforce. Because some of these hazards are behavioral issues, and it relates to workplace bullying and poor behaviors and conflict, if you ask your workers who those people are, they will tell you, because they work with them every day. So you need to consult your workers. In Australia, it's a legal obligation to do so, but other countries not so much. But just ask your staff. They're the people that are at the front end of work. They know what works and what doesn't, and who the good and the bad people are.
Martyn, you know, when companies are thinking about psychosocial safety, and especially as you rightly mentioned that there's legislative requirements in some countries, and we're talking about the context of Australia, but I believe there are other countries as well that has this. What have you seen are the most common misperceptions that companies might have about the way that they approach the topic and the way they think about it generally?
Yeah, look, what we've seen in Australia, and certainly like the UK is starting to go down this path and implement legislation. I was recently over in Taiwan speaking at a conference over there, and the Taiwanese government and the Taiwanese regulator is looking at legislative change to address workplace bullying specifically. The regulator in Taiwan was saying they have a huge issue with workplace bullying complaints. What we've seen in Australia is really a bit of sort of a lack of clarity and understanding from businesses. They generally don't really understand where to start, so they don't do anything, and that's probably the worst thing you can do. So the data we've seen in Australia for the last few years is when somebody's physically injured at work, there's a workers' compensation scheme which provides for that worker's medical bills and salary. The average cost of a physical injury to that compensation scheme is about 60,000 Australian dollars per claim. The average cost for a psychological injury is $300,000 per claim. Six
What?
times. Yeah. That's the average cost per claim for a psychological injury. And it's generally because with a physical injury, you can see the injury, and it's treated by a medical doctor. But with the psychological injuries, they are treated by psychiatrists and psychologists, and generally 2 or 3 opinions. And they're expensive, and the bills rack up pretty quickly. And the data has showed that it takes on average 3 to 5 times longer for somebody to return to work after a psychological injury than a physical, if they ever do at all. So whilst the numbers of psychological injury is still lower than physical injury, they're rising quicker, and the cost of them is significantly higher, and it takes longer for people to come back to work than a physical injury. So you don't need too many psychological injuries for that to really impact the workers' compensation scheme, and the cost to business. So one of the questions I get from executives is like, why should we bother? And the reality is, well, first of all, it's the law, you have to do it. Secondly, it makes good business sense. There's a lot of research to say that if you treat people well, then their productivity increases, absenteeism reduces, presenteeism reduces, people are more engaged, they don't leave, they stay in the workplace because generally they're happier. So there's some productivity benefits to doing the right thing. And lastly, it impacts your bottom line. If you're psychologically hurting people, they're expensive claims, and your insurance will start to increase significantly. So there are some sort of solid business reasons to do it, as well as like morally and ethically, it's just the right thing to treat people well.
Hello everyone! If you are studying about safety culture, leadership, risk perception, I would like to recommend my books. They are available in Amazon.com, and each book is an experience to go deep diving in safety culture, and I think will add value in your journey.
Do you ever wonder whether you're making the impact and have the influence that you're really, really looking for in your corporate career, perhaps if you're an entrepreneur or doing something else? Well, I offer one-on-one coaching services for purpose-driven leaders who are really looking to find some way of increasing their impact and their influence. So if this is something you're interested in, give me a call, send me a DM, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
You're talking about how to measure the good results, né? So decrease absenteeism, improve the presentialism. So what kind more KPIs we can add to measure the level of psychosocial safety?
Yeah, I mean, measuring these things are quite difficult and very different to what we've always measured in safety. So generally, I mean, I've been in safety 20 years now, and generally the usual measurements are injury rates, injury types, frequency rates, like a bit boring and don't really mean too much. For the psychosocial safety, we can start using engagement surveys. We can start measuring attrition rates. You can start measuring feedback from exit interviews. So we at Humn, we use a a survey tool at the start of the risk process to get a really clear picture of the landscape and understand which ones of those 17 hazards are relevant to the business, because not all of them might be relevant to the work you do. So, but the only way to really get a clear picture of your risk landscape is to ask your workforce and engage them. And if the workforce have high degrees of psychological safety, if they feel comfortable to raise their hand and say there's a problem, you probably already know where that is because they'll be telling you. But if there's low degrees of psychological safety and people are worried about telling you the truth because they might get sacked or disciplined, then they'll be keeping that quiet. So you need to make that process anonymous and give workers the opportunity to say things without fear of retribution and feedback. And I say to executives, you should embrace that. If it's bad news, that's okay, because now you know. The challenge from the regulator is, what are you going to do about it? So embrace bad news, ask your staff. If the feedback is terrible, then it just means you've got a low bar to start. The next stage is, right, what are we going to do?
You know, when we start in this process, we start to comply. And after that, we moving in and we find the commitment inside the companies. I am Brazilian, and Brazil this year start a regulation specific about psychological safety or psychosocial safety. And we start to measure, we start the identification from the companies, and after that start to manage this data and start to put some plans to try to minimize it, to facing this. What's your recommendation to Brazilians that is watching us today about this? What is the lessons learning from Australia at this point?
So I think the first lesson is for every leader that's listening to this is, do not be frightened about doing it, and don't be frightened to start. Even if the news is bad, it's okay. It just gives you your starting position. The next thing is to include your workforce in the solution. Ask people and they will tell you. I always say to people, there are two things I get organizations to focus on, which makes the implementation of systems very, very simple or easier. First one is trust, and the second one is psychological safety. So if you want to create a psychosocially safe system, having people feeling comfortable to raise issues without fear of retribution is incredibly important. That's psychological safety. If people are frightened to tell you, it makes implementing it very difficult, if not impossible. To get psychological safety, people need to trust you. So I always say to people, work on trust. It's the keystone that locks everything together. And if you've got trust, psychological safety will then follow. Leadership response matters. And there are elements of human organizational performance that I like to use in this. So it's around sort of no blame, error is normal, leadership response matters. Those three things are really important in this. So if leaders demonstrate those and demonstrate that it's okay to make mistakes and that we're learning from it and there's no blame, that helps to build the trust and the psychological safety. Implementing everything else becomes simpler after you've got that. If not, it's a real hard slog.
Martyn, you know what this reminds me of? Because I've also been working in safety for many decades, probably more than I'm willing to admit at some point. And it reminds me of, the good old days where we were starting to teach people about risk assessments and, very fundamental points of view of how to identify hazards and evaluate the risk and to collaborate or consult with workers. And even though there were legislative frameworks, I think the principles were more important, to take this broader perspective. Do you think the same will eventually apply to psychosocial safety as well? Because one thing I hear, and I think you're saying the same, is that people are, and companies are a little confused. In some countries, they're seeing these laws being enacted but then sometimes they maybe feel a little helpless as well. You know, what can they do? What proportion of a psychological injury is attributed to work versus perhaps something else? Just so many questions that people have around the topic.
Yeah, and I think it's like anything that's new. People, there are early adopters, and then there's the laggards, and then you have the majority in the middle who sort of go with the flow. But I think because this is quite new and quite different, some organizations have embraced it very early and very quickly, and they've had some really good success. And that's because they've taken a collaborative approach. So they've blended psychology, safety, HR, and IR together to craft solutions. So they've been really good, and they're pretty advanced. The vast majority of people, we're still coming up that diffusion curve. So we're not even at the majority of that momentum tipping point yet. But what I've seen in Australia in particular is a lot of people are really just still sort of watching the crowd and trying to understand what good is. So I've had comments made to me from leaders about, well, such as, well, workers just need to toughen up, and psychological safety is about letting people do what they want, right? It's like, no, it's not about workers doing what they want whenever they want, because that's chaos. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's about having some rules and procedures that put boundaries around how people work and behave. And some of the controls that we help people pull together are things like codes of conduct, codes of ethics, like really clear, transparent, and fair performance management processes, which reward good behavior and address underperformance. Around leadership development programs, like a lot of bullying complaints stem from leaders, but I always ask organizations, have you given the leaders the training, the skills, and the knowledge to be an effective leader? Or were they just great on the shop floor, so you've promoted them? So the controls for psychosocial safety are very different, because it's about having those codes of conduct, codes of ethics, behavioral standards, leadership training and development programs, clear feedback, clear reward and recognition programs, and performance management programs. And it's about holding people accountable. So I was in Melbourne yesterday and last week, undertaking an investigation for a company, and they've got several psychosocial complaints of workplace bullying, and the behavior is probably not bullying, but there's just a lack of that clarity around performance management. So people are being held accountable for behaviors at work, and they don't like it. So they're saying, my boss is bullying me. They're not being bullied. They're just being held accountable for poor behavior. And we don't want that at work. But in order to be held accountable for poor behavior, you need to know what the standard is and what's expected and what's not expected. So it's about organizations harnessing those controls. And when you look at them, like things like code of conduct, code of ethics, performance management frameworks, they've always been a HR role, not a safety role. So when you look for the control, you look for your HR team. But in Australia, psychosocial safety is part of the Work Health and Safety Act and the law. So it's generally owned by the safety team. So the safety team would fail miserably if they didn't include the HR people in part of the solution.
And I think considering all this information that you are putting here, how we can build in this kind of competence, create this capability, because as you commented, what is the difference? Chaos and accountability. Accountability, we need to implement foundations about the codes, about how the people understand the rules, understand all the policies from the company, and specifically your role and responsibility. So sometimes I think this piece, we don't put on the table when we start this process. How you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, For me, a lot of it stems from like organizational values and leadership. So like I talk to executives about what are the organizational values, what are the behaviors that you are setting, because at the top of the organization, everybody watches the behavior of their leader and their manager, and people generally replicate that or do something at work in order to keep people happy. So if leaders are rewarding the wrong thing and behaving the wrong way, then that sets the culture and the values. So, and from a psychosocial safety perspective, what the research is identifying is that people who don't fit with that value or that leadership style will walk, they leave. The more options somebody has, the quicker they'll exit the organization. So I say to people, monitor your attrition rate. How many people are leaving the organization, and what percentage is your attrition rate compared to the rest of the industry? Because if your good people are leaving, it means that the people with less options aren't, and it's not because they don't want to leave, it's because they're just struggling to find something else. So they'll be the ones that sit in silence at their desk, head down, being pretty miserable because they can't find another job. So organizational leadership and values and what you reward is really important. Simon Sinek said it really well in his little video clip around the Navy SEALs and how people reward. Like if you're rewarding toxicity and toxic behaviors, then that sends a huge message to everyone else in the business, and probably the wrong one. So it's about rewarding the right things and the right people in the right way in a transparent and fair process. And then that will allow others to mirror and replicate those behaviors.
Hello everyone! If you are studying about safety culture, leadership, risk perception, I would like to recommend my books. They are available in Amazon.com, and each book is an experience to go deep diving in safety culture, and I think will add value in your journey.
Do you ever wonder whether you're making the impact and have the influence that you're really, really looking for in your corporate career, perhaps if you're an entrepreneur or doing something else? Well, I offer one-on-one coaching services for purpose-driven leaders who are really looking to find some way of increasing their impact and their influence. So if this is something you're interested in, give me a call, send me a DM, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
Inside the organizations, do you perceive the leaders, the middle managers or the immediate leaders, they have more difficult and they need more attention? Because I think when we are talking about in high levels of organization, the managers, the directors, they understand very well what this means. But I think the middle managers, so what do you think and how we can help them, the immediate leaders?
Yeah, look, 100% correct. It's that middle leadership group from supervisor to manager to sort of general manager that are the critical roles. If they understand it and they are demonstrating solid psychosocially safe leadership principles, then that's really your key. But the challenge we have is, do organizations set those people up for success? Do we provide them with the skills, knowledge, and abilities and processes for them to be really great middle managers? Or do we just promote good workers and then hope that they'll do a great job as a manager? So, and generic leadership programs probably not going to give you the results you want. Generally, the leadership programs should be tailored to the needs of the individuals and the organization. So understand what your risks are, understand what your psychosocial risks are, which ones are relevant to your business, develop a leadership program around those risks, and plug the gap. So create a leadership program that includes things like having critical conversations, performance management reviews, how to treat people and speak to them in a psychologically safe way that doesn't trigger them, and how to understand people's peculiarities and diversity. So we're not all the same, and you can't paint everybody with the same brush from a leadership perspective. So it's those sorts of skills as middle managers that we need to sort of adapt to and create success for them.
Martyn, you've often spoken about moving from fixing symptoms to fixing systems. In reality, what does that look like in day-to-day world and for organisations? What should they be doing? Because I think we have been talking a lot about the various aspects of psychosocial health and safety, but the cold, hard reality is that businesses are out there trying to be successful. Many of them are working really hard to build high-performing teams. But what does it mean to build effective systems?
Yeah, look, I'm a bit of a systems thinker. I like some of the systems thinking concepts, and I'm also a big fan of coaching. So I've been an executive coach for a long time. So I try and blend a bit of systems thinking and a bit of sort of human-centric coaching approaches to solutions. In Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the legislation is performance-based, so it talks around managing hazards and risks. It doesn't tell you how to do things. So it's not legislation that says, if it's a working at heights issue, this is what you must do in a prescriptive way. It says, that's a risk. There are risks associated with the job. Eliminate them or control them to a level that's reasonably practicable. So the regulators want to see some action to manage those risks. The higher the risk, the more action the regulator expects you to take. The same applies with the psychosocial safety as it does to physical safety. The regulator wants to see organizations understand which of those hazards relate to their work, that they've risk assessed them, and that they're putting some controls in place in consultation with the workers. If you can start that process, the regulator will be really happy. Certainly the regulators I know in Australia and New Zealand, they're not expecting a Rolls-Royce version of a system immediately. They know that it's a journey, and but they just want to see people start the journey. They want to see some action. So the legislation in Australia came in 2 years ago, and there's three or four states and territories over here now who are really active in the compliance space. And what I mean by that is New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland are actively knocking on the doors of business and saying, hey, we're here to talk around psychosocial safety. What are you doing about it? Where's your risk assessment? How are you identifying which of the hazards relate to your work? And what are you doing to control them? And so that's stimulated a bit of activity from businesses. It's not a level playing field, so the regulator will not expect every business to be doing the same thing. So if you own a small convenience store, then the regulator will expect you to start the process, but the controls might be fairly minimal. But if you're a multinational mining company, then they'll expect you to invest a significant amount of time and effort and money into that. So, and some of those hazards are pretty significant. So, like one of the hazards, for example, is workplace harassment and violence and aggression. So, and that includes sexual harassment, violence, and aggression, and sort of gender-related biases. So, organizations should be looking at that as a psychosocial hazard. What are you doing around workplace sexual and physical violence, harassment, and aggression? And if you've got a policy, then that's great, but please don't make that the only thing you've got. Like, you've got to do something behind that. What are you doing to try and stop it? And that's where the controls start to come into play, because there should be some standards, some documents, some procedures, code of ethics, values, code of conduct, but there should also be some training for staff. There should also be some form of ability to ventilate issues. So things like whistleblower protection programs and hotlines where people can call up and raise issues, investigation processes. So the organization should have a process to investigate these things. And ironically, there was some recent case law in Australia where the employment courts ruled that the HR investigation to deal with some of these psychosocial safety issues is not enough. So you can't just treat it as a HR issue, which is generally, we're going to speak to parties, somebody gets disciplined or sacked, and away they go. There's got to be a more rigorous investigation program that incorporates things like procedural fairness, the ability for everyone to speak and hold account, effective decision making based on evidence, a trauma-informed, person-centric approach. So you need to think about who makes the complaint and who responds. And an example there I'll give you is I do a lot of work in the mining industry around the world. A lot of safety professionals in the mining industry tend to be middle-aged men, but now there's a lot more younger men and women coming into the workforce. We had a complaint by a 21-year-old female truck driver and around sexual harassment, and the person who interviewed her was a 55-year-old 6'3" male. Not appropriate. You've got to ask that individual how they want to be treated and spoken to. It's incredibly confronting and embarrassing for a 21-year-old female to explain how she was sexually harassed to a 55-year-old male. So it's those sorts of approaches. You've got to start thinking about how you treat those and how you deal with them as a business. It's not difficult, but there are some steps that you need to take, and it's understanding those steps. And I say to organizations, if you don't know what those steps are, or you're really scratching your head, there's a number of different places you can go for help, and it doesn't have to be expensive or time consuming. It can be fairly cheap and quick.
Martyn, I was thinking about some actions to facing the psychosocial safety. And our last guest comes from a military organization. And he was talking about all the efforts from military organization, to improve psychosocial safety, mental health. And I was here now realize some actions are systemic and others are holistic. So talk with family, right? So do you see this? Do you have some example about these holistic actions that we need to implement?
Oh, good question. Look, I think part of the response to the whole psychosocial safety concept is the legislation requires a system to manage it. The system is applied the same way as physical injuries. The difference is the controls. Part of the controls is understanding that people bring psychological issues to work with them from home and other places. So it's about understanding that. It doesn't mean to say that the business is responsible or liable for that. But it's about leadership having the skills and abilities to understand that we're all different and we all bring stress and challenges to work. And that sometimes, if we're not performing at work, it's not necessarily an individual personal thing. It's just like we all have bad days and things go on in our lives. And organizations need to be receptive to that, and leaders need to be receptive and have a bit of emotional intelligence to identify it and then help people along the way. So that's not about sort of performance at work, but you can't treat people the same way all the time. Like, you need to give people the ability to ventilate issues. If people are having marital issues and there's money or there's health issues with loved ones at home, I'll guarantee you people will bring that stress to work with them. And that stress will come out in their work performance. It goes back to the psychological safety question. If people feel psychologically safe, they're probably going to go to their leader and tell them they're having a shit day. and why. And it's about creating that environment for people to feel comfortable to say, hey, I'm not at my best today because this is happening at home. And someone saying, thanks very much for sharing that with me. That's awful to hear. How can I help you?
Martyn, you know something that's not lost on me, and it's maybe a couple of points back when you were talking about investigation of situations, and also at the moment the approach that the regulators are broadly taking in terms of asking for risk assessments, and then perhaps some of the interactions that companies have with the regulators is around the way that they investigate these psychosocial or psychological incidents. What's not lost on me is how in traditional health and safety, I don't remember seeing a time where a regulator was critiquing and giving feedback on the way an investigation was performed. And that just feels so different to, I was going to say normal health and safety, and please don't give me bad comments about that, because I can't think of a different word. But it's really interesting, isn't it? If regulators, what they're focusing on is the process of investigation in addition to the actual context of what was happening as well.
Yeah, it is a very different approach, and look, regulators are still at this, are coming up that learning curve as well. So it's difficult for them also, and it's also a new skill set for regulators to introduce, because they've always been investigating physical safety, not the mental health and well-being. So it's a challenge for them as well, and but I think that in the last probably 12 months in Australia, there's some interesting case law that's come out of the industrial courts around psychosocial safety complaints, and people are using those psychosocial safety hazards, not only not only from a regulator's perspective, so the regulator coming in and prosecuting you, they're using them in other areas of law. So an example being, there was a case about 5-6 months ago in Australia. It's called Vision Australia, which is a charity for people who struggle with sight. So there was a particularly prickly individual who worked there who just generally wasn't a great person to be around. And he was given a warning through their HR process, and then didn't change his behavior and was eventually terminated. So he took that company to court for unfair dismissal and won. In Australia, the unfair dismissal process limits the amount of money that you can claim. So he got, I think, $27,000 in damages, which was the maximum that he could get. But Vision Australia had a HR process to investigate complaints, and they didn't follow their own procedure and made mistakes and errors. He then took them to court and said, because they didn't follow their own procedure, that caused him a psychological injury. And the court upheld that and said, yes, that's correct. And awarded him $1.3 million in damages. So people are using the psychological safety angle to take legal action for other areas of law around termination and breach of contract. So it's really important for organizations to review their procedures, and when you do review them, man, you need to follow them. Like, don't just write a bit of paper and leave it on the shelf. Like, because as a regulator, I've lost count of the number of times I've prosecuted an organization and used their own procedures against them. So, like, sometimes less is more. The law is around managing risk. I think in Australia, there's about 4 things that the law says you must write down. Outside of that, it doesn't say anything about procedures. It says you need to be able to produce evidence to show you've got a system of work. Generally, the easiest way to do that is to produce a procedure. But the challenge is to make sure the procedures got value to the worker safety, that keeps workers safe, and then you follow it. Because if you don't, it's just a bit of paper and it's not worth anything. Doesn't help workers, doesn't keep people safe, and it certainly won't protect you from being prosecuted by the regulator.
Hello everyone! If you are studying about safety culture, leadership, risk perception, I would like to recommend my books. They are available in Amazon.com, and each book is an experience to go deep diving in safety culture, and I think will add value in your journey.
Do you ever wonder whether you're making the impact and have the influence that you're really, really looking for in your corporate career, perhaps if you're an entrepreneur or doing something else? Well, I offer one-on-one coaching services for purpose-driven leaders who are really looking to find some way of increasing their impact and their influence. So if this is something you're interested in, give me a call, send me a DM, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
And I think this happen all the time because establishing paperwork is easy. Yeah, it's very bureaucratic, I have implemented. The people know what this means and how this applies and how they can use this in your daily basis. So this answer is no. I like when I go to make a diagnostic and a safety culture diagnostic. Last year, I have been 100 diagnostics in Brazil. So all the time I use the same questions. What is safety for you? And safety is a procedure, is a standard, is a direction, is a rule, is a KPI that I need to comply, is a task, is a routine. What is? Is equipment. So it's the same applies here in this discussion. I hear you, and we have the same challenge in moving to comply to commitment. I think the organization that can facing the challenge about psychosocial safety is the commitment, is about commitment.
Yeah. When I took over at SafeWork South Australia, the organisation, it's probably fair to say, was failing to be a regulator, and we had to change significantly the way we operated. One of the changes was to rewrite the process around how we investigated as a regulator, and one of the things I used to say to the investigators, or we trained them, and it still happens now, is they'll walk into an organization and ask leaders and people on the shop floor and ask them the questions. What can kill you? What job are you doing? What can kill you? What can seriously hurt you? What are you doing to stop that? And then they'll talk to the procedure and say, do you have a procedure on this? Most workers won't have read the procedure, and even if they might not even know there's one there. But I'll guarantee you, if you've got more than 10 procedures to do tasks, your workers haven't read them. No one's got time to read 10 procedures or more. So it's a comfort blanket for leadership. They think it's a comfort blanket because they've got a procedure. As a former regulator, I'll tell you now, it's not a comfort blanket. So I used to say to leaders all the time, tell me what your top 5 risks are. Tell me what high risk tasks are going to kill people. What are you doing to stop that? What are the tasks that are going to seriously hurt people? What are you doing to stop that? And show me the evidence that you've considered the controls. And then lastly, which is the bit everyone forgets, is whatever controls you put in place, make sure that you check they are working as intended. So it's about effectiveness. And leaders often forget that. And I say to people, there's a huge amount of value in getting out your office, grabbing a coffee and going talking to your workers around what works for them, what doesn't, what are they working around, and what needs to change, and helping them implement some practical solutions. And because they know where the issues are. They do this job every single day. So go and talk to them.
Here's the thing, though. And I'm trying to work out how to say this, Martyn. In traditional health and safety areas, when you think about health and or safety hazards, many of them are there in a workplace and they're similar day to day. They might be different contexts and there might be different applications and ways that people interact with those hazards. But is it wrong to think that psychosocial hazards are really, really different? That, even if you do a risk assessment, could they change minute to minute, day to day, depending on how the humans are behaving?
Yeah, 100%. They can, and I think is because some of those psychosocial safety hazards are behavioural, people related, then yeah, they are going to change all the time because we all come to work different every day, and generally it's something outside of work which causes us to be a little bit different. Stresses at home, stresses in relationships, health issues, money worries, they all play on our mind, on our psyche, which affects the way we operate. And it goes back to creating a psychologically safe work environment. Is if you've got high degrees of psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson says in her books, then people will come and tell you and have that conversation. And as a leader, that's what we want people to do. And if you think in that human organizational performance way as well, and bringing some of those concepts in, is that error is normal. We know people are going to make mistakes, and we know people are going to be different every day. So let's embrace it and tolerate it and work with people to solve it. If you know your one of your workers is suffering significant stress from a home issue, do you really want them operating high risk equipment or doing cognitively challenging tasks? Probably not. You're probably going to help them do something different that day. So it's, for me, it still sort of goes back to psychological safety and trust are the sort of key things in this whole system. Leadership training and behaviors and being able to recognize it and responses, accepting variance and difference, and encouraging people to come forward and tell you when things are not going well for them, and so that you can help manage them. Because the last thing I would want would be somebody whose mind is not on the job because of personal issues to then be operating safety critical machinery, equipment, or doing highly challenging cognitive tasks. Do you really want a brain surgeon or a heart surgeon to be working on you when they're worried about relationship issues at home because they've had an argument with the loved one that night? And probably not.
Do you find, though, that employers are saying, well, I have work to do here. We have productivity quotas. We need to get products out the door, so I need someone to drive the forklift that day. How can employers be thinking about this balance between providing a healthy and safe workforce and workplace, and at the same time, the constraints that they're under to run a business?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that point around it's not a level playing field, so the regulators don't expect every organization to do the same thing. You can only do what's reasonably practicable for your business. In Australia, the legislation describes what that is, and the ability of people and availability of resources and finances are considerations that businesses need to take into account. So there's not an expectation that smaller organizations will have fantastic processes and systems, but there is an expectation that they need to consider them and then put something in place in consultation with the workers. So, and it's not a case of that the regulator will expect businesses to be closing down because people don't feel like working that day and they're all sitting around the lunchroom watching TV. That's not what we're talking around. It's about having a system and a process to raise issues and deal with it, but work still needs to carry on. People still need to make money, and businesses need to exist. It's just got to be done in a psychologically safe manner. So, and and some of the controls that organizations might want to consider, what we've worked with is controls around workforce planning and workforce strategy. So it's around who else can operate the forklift, and so maybe as an organization you might need 2 or 3 forklift operators to be trained and competent, just in case that one person is off sick or is having a bad day. You can switch them out. So multiskilling, training people in other people's roles, and is a valid strategy, a control strategy, where you can say, hey, look, we've thought about this and this is what we're going to do in this situation. So I'm going to swap Martyn out with Megan. Megan's going to drive the forklift for the morning, and then we'll reassess how Martyn feels in the afternoon. And if he's all good, he's back on it. If not, then we'll revisit it the next day. So they're the sorts of things that organizations need to think a little bit about.
Martyn, talking about supervisor, I was thinking, for me, be a supervisor is the most difficult role in a company today. Okay. So what kind of collaboration or collaborative environment you see in your career to help them? Because it's a key role, but it's super difficult. Because sometimes we have a supervisor, but 2 weeks ago he was a good operator and giving to the company good results. So we promote him. So how are you facing this, create this environment, with collaboration?
Yeah. One of the things I did at SafeWork is in our workforce strategy and planning process, we created a leadership program for the organization. The leadership program was at the executive level, senior manager, and supervisor, but it linked together so that it was a leadership program that connected, so we were all on the same page. I've worked in organizations previously where if you have a leadership program just for one level, it's probably not going to work, because people start to do things differently and they butt heads with the people above them. So everyone needs to be on the same page in relation to what leadership is and how we operate. So I think it's really important that we train our leaders and supervisors, but once you get a mature system in place, then we can start training on our future leaders so that they are leadership ready, which is ultimately where we want to be. So if somebody's a great operator and we're going to promote them to supervisor, then 100% we need to train that person in leadership skills and give them every opportunity to be a successful supervisor. But when we've done that, we need to start identifying the next level, who's coming through the ranks, who are likely going to be the next level or the next supervisors, and start proactively training them before they get into the role. So when you've got a mature system, that's something that works really well, is you're targeting the future leaders in the organization and giving them the skills before they get in the job. And then it gives them opportunity to practice it and hone it. And what I found is those behaviors and those skills then just become part of work, and it's the fabric of the organization. It's the way we speak to each other. It's how we treat each other. There's dignity and respect. It doesn't mean everyone's doing it all the time. People are still bullies, and unfortunately, bullies don't come to a job interview with a badge saying I'm a bully or I'm going to harass somebody. It's behaviors which tend to pop out after you've employed somebody. Regulators understand that, but this is around challenging and stopping that behavior really quickly. So when it does pop up, you're on top of it and everyone else stamps it down. People are dealt with properly, fairly, and quickly, and then we move on.
Hello everyone! If you are studying about safety culture, leadership, risk perception, I would like to recommend my books. They are available in Amazon.com, and each book is an experience to go deep diving in safety culture, and I think will add value in your journey.
ever wonder whether you're making the impact and have the influence that you're really, really looking for in your corporate career, perhaps if you're an entrepreneur or doing something else? Well, I offer one-on-one coaching services for purpose-driven leaders who are really looking to find some way of increasing their impact and their influence. So if this is something you're interested in, give me a call, send me a DM, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
When you're talking about companies that have a good maturity level in terms of psychosocial safety, I understand that some rituals change the frequency. For example, feedback. So when you're talking about 2 feedbacks per year, so it's impossible, right? Waiting 6 months to a feedback, to have a conversation face to face. In my diagnostics, I asking for the people, the meetings that we have with your team is a meeting to inform something or is a meeting to discuss something? 8% say is just information. We share information, we share results, we share some things that happen that the people need to know, policies that change, procedures, new things. So the rituals change. Can you give me more examples about this, about the frequency or different rituals that we can implement to create this mature psychosocial safety organization?
Yeah, good, great point. So I think firstly for me, if somebody's underperforming, then it shouldn't be a surprise to them when that underperformance discussion happens. Because generally, if performance management is done properly, then people will know many weeks beforehand that they're not doing what is expected. So the performance management framework, which again is always a HR function, they own that that process. So organizations that I work in previously and the ones that we work in now, we try to create a framework where there's a regular discussion point between the worker and the supervisor, and then supervisors and managers. So and that can be as often as weekly or fortnightly, but generally for a worker supervisor is to have a fortnightly discussion around work. And that addresses a couple of psychosocial safety hazards. One around poor support, because you're actually you're giving people support on a regular basis. And then organizational justice and fairness, because you're operating within a performance management process. So weekly or maybe fortnightly, probably definitely not more than or any further than a month apart. At the longest, but having regular discussions around work. What are your barriers? What are you seeing? What are your challenges? What's working for you? What's not working for you? This is what as a leader, this is what I'm seeing from you. What do you want from me? It's that sort of two-way conversation around giving people the opportunity for success. Those types of conversations become really important in the leadership program, because you need to train supervisors in how to have them so that the language is psychologically safe as well. So people feel engaged and comfortable, and it's not seen as an interrogation. So when you have those fortnightly discussions, you can build a picture up very quickly of how people are performing, and it builds motivation and engagement. People know that they're supported by the leader, but it also allows you to address non-performance and performance frameworks which identify underperformance is critical. If somebody makes a mistake, that's normal. We all make mistakes. Error's normal. So you address it and you move on. But if people are making the same mistake, then we need to understand why. And is it a system issue or is it a person issue? Because if people are making the same mistake multiple times, then we need to drill down as to what's causing that. And if it's a performance issue, they just can't be bothered, or they're not following the rules, then we need to address it. But it shouldn't be sort of arbitrary sanctions or discipline, it's got to be done in a fair manner so that everyone else making similar mistakes is treated in the same way and gets the same level of sanction, so that people don't feel as though they've been hard done to or it's been too severe for them. So these sort of controls, when it comes together, is a sort of good example of how you can end up with 2 or 3 psychosocial hazards that work across safety and HR, that require rules and procedures and clarity for the worker, but also leadership skills and training for the individual. But when you end up putting those together, you end up in a process or a framework where good work is rewarded quickly and publicly, hopefully, and underperformance is addressed quickly as well, and people learn from it and move on. And if they don't learn from it and move on, then we can hold them accountable to that. And I think accountability is really important, because for me, it's a big part of psychosocial safety. Without accountability, it's a free for all, and that's not what we want as a business.
That's amazing. You know, when Andresa and I were thinking about conversations we wanted to have on the Headline podcast, we wanted to have conversations with people about topical issues and things that are on people's mind. And certainly this topic, I think, is on people's mind a lot at the moment for many different reasons, right? There are people who are supportive of the approach and probably have seen the need for organisations to have more conversations and take more actions about psychosocial health and safety. There's also been plenty of objections to it. And Martyn, I think you've even talked about some of those today. But as I reflect on the conversation that we're having, what it makes me think about is how it actually can help companies build high-performing teams and also build very resilient workforces by thinking about the very complex nature of human beings and the complexities of running a business. And if one can think about these different aspects, then perhaps actually they can build an even more successful business. Now, tell me, am I just, dreaming this? Am I being too altruistic about it all? Or do you see that with some of your clients that you're working with Humn and, things that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, 100%. This is all, for me, I often go back. Richard Branson said something about Virgin many years ago, and he said, treating your workforce well is incredibly important, because they are the people who interact with your customers. So if your customers want a great experience, they're going to get that through the staff. And some people, some good leaders get that, and they do it anyway. And so psychosocial safety for those people is really easy because they're doing it already. And so those are the sorts of organizations we try to put on a pedestal and say to people, if you want to see what good looks like, look here. And there's a few of those companies around Australia. The vast majority at the moment are still sort of struggling to understand what it means for them. That they understand what the law is, and they've seen presentations now about 17 hazards. But the challenge for those guys and even the safety professionals is, but what's the next step? How do we actually do it? And that's where we've been helping a lot of organizations. You're 100% correct, Megan. For me, this is, it hits about 3 or 4 really big targets. It complies with the law, which is you've got to do anyway. But it's just good business sense, because all the research shows that happy, engaged, and psychologically safe workers stay in a business, go the extra mile, put in the discretionary effort, treat your customers with respect and dignity, and give them a great experience, and then don't go on the sick and don't leave. So it's a sort of win-win. Some of the leaders that I speak to, they get that and they're on board really quickly, and which is makes my job incredibly easy. But then others Others need a bit more convincing, and it's like, oh well, this is all just fluffy unicorns and rainbows. Like, people just need to toughen up, and it's like, well, no, it's not about toughening up. It's around keeping people happy and engaged and mentally healthy and well. It's a little bit of stress is good. It helps us grow and develop as humans and as organizations. It stretches us professionally. But too much stress becomes distress. And when you have distress over long periods of time, that causes anxiety and depression and other clinical illnesses. And that's the stuff that we're trying to stop. So as you're trying to stop that, you just need to be comfortable that people will be unhappy at different times for different things, but create an environment for people to flag it and come and tell you, and then help them move on and get around it. So for me, it is all linked. And I'm in my 50s now. I've worked for some great organizations and people in the past. I've worked for some terrible organizations and people in the past. And I think I'm probably representative of the majority. We've all had bad experiences. And I think I often sort of look back on those experiences and say, well, this is the sort of behavior we're trying to stop. And this is the sort of culture we're trying to change. And it starts with leadership. And if leadership don't value it, I'll guarantee you everyone will be pretty unhappy and miserable further down the organization. And sometimes people just need a bit of a prod to start the journey. And sometimes that prod can come from us. Sometimes it comes from the regulator.
If we are talking, I come from an emerging country. And emerging country facing high levels of turnover, Martyn. So this for me is one challenge and one kind of challenge to implement psychosocial safety, a culture of psychosocial safety. Do you see different kinds of challenge like this turnover? What we can add in a list of challenges to implement psychosocial safety?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because in the last couple of years, I've seen the psychosocial safety risks are very different for every organization. So it's difficult, but it's also very bad form to apply the same solution to every organization. So at Human, we don't apply a common solution to everybody. It's specific to the business. Understanding your risk landscape at the start is incredibly important, because out of those 17 hazards, if you go and ask your staff and survey them, you might find that there's only 5 of those hazards really relevant to the work that you do. And if that's how the data comes back, then you've got your 5 indicators you need to address straight away. Now, 2 of them might be quite a low level issue, 3 of them might be high. So argument's sake, micromanagement and workplace bullying and sexual harassment, violence, discrimination might be the 3 big issues. Well, guess what? That's what we're addressing first. And we work with organizations in manageable stages. It's that whole concept of eating the elephant. It's just a little bit at a time. Don't try and address everything at once. Pick your biggest risks. If you want to know what your biggest risks are, ask your staff. They'll tell you. And then you can start putting solutions in place. And once you've got those top 3 under control, then we're going to move on to the next 2 or 3 and the next 2 or 3. And give it a year, 18 months, you start to build a system which managing all of them. And throughout that whole process, keep going back to your staff and re-engaging them and checking in with them, survey, and see how you're tracking.
So, Martyn, when I think about your career and how you've gone from a lawyer to be involved in health and safety, to be the chief executive of a regulator, and now you're in this new phase of your career, focusing on psychosocial health, supporting companies with that endeavor. did you ever think that this is where you would be? And what advice do you have for people, perhaps as they're thinking through their careers and the zigs and the zags of what maybe you might want to achieve in your life?
Oh man, yeah. Look, I'm incredibly grateful the career I've had. None of it was really planned, if I'm truthful. Um, I had 20 years as a detective in the police in London and the UK before qualifying as a lawyer in the UK and then doing my master's in law in Australia. My plan was to practice law in Australia, but I got a job at the safety regulator 20 years ago, and that was my entry into health and safety. And then I've worked all over the world: Africa, Brunei, Indonesia, Asia, everywhere. And I've been to some incredible places, but I, everything I've done has been an opportunity. So things have presented themselves along the way, and I've grasped those opportunities and done something with it. I think the big one for me is never stop learning, never stop reading, and make your own mind up. I think the last 5 years or so, the last 5 to 7 years in safety has been probably the most challenging, confusing time for safety professionals. There's so many different themes and concepts of safety one, safety two, differently, resilience engineering, and who's right, who's wrong. And I say to people, do you know what? There are elements of each one which have merit, and you need to read them, understand them, and apply them into your organization's culture and what works. So don't just drink the Kool-Aid and try and put one thing in place, because lots of things work for lots of different reasons in lots of different businesses. So never stop learning, read widely, make your own mind up. Don't be afraid to try something new. And I think there's a bit of a safety professional in everyone. It just hasn't got out in some people yet.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent.
Don't exit prescription.
Yeah. And if we need anyone to investigate, sounds like Martyn's our guy, 20 years as a detective.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you've probably got another hour of stories to tell us there, but we might need to wrap it up for today. And thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for an amazing conversation.
No, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, Andreza, thank you as well. And
Thank you, Martyn. It was incredible.
And if anyone is still around listening after more than an hour of our conversation here with Martyn, as always, we would love if you would subscribe, give us a thumbs up as we continue to grow Headline Podcast with some of the best resources and voices in health and safety, leadership and culture that we can find on this planet. So thank you. And Martyn Campbell, you're one of them. Thank you, Andreza. Thank you, Martyn.